Well, hello, folks. My name is Benjamin Z. Miller, and welcome to the Benjamin Z. Miller Investor Networking Group. We've got a great presentation this week. We are going to talk about mezzanine lending. It is such an interesting topic, and mezzanine lenders oftentimes have a reputation as being like loan sharks because the interest rate that they charge on loans is so high. It's quite an interesting area. And if you're an investor, it's definitely something you need to know about. So let's take the example here of a mezzanine lender that makes a loan of 250,000 at an 18% rate of interest to a real estate investor. Let's imagine the real estate investor already has first lien financing in place where maybe there's some sort of a loan already that exists, but he wants to borrow 250,000 to do some renovations on the property. And he goes to a mezzanine lender, he secures a loan at 18%. Maybe he already owes, for example, $1 million on the property. He borrows 250,000. And then when he borrows that 250,000, he actually is in the situation where he is starting to receive interest payments. The lender is in a situation where they're getting 18%, but the lender's not in a first lien position. They're technically in a mezzanine lending position. So in this example, if the borrower goes through a situation where they're not able to keep up with the payments, say something happens where they can't keep up with the payments, in that case, what happens is the lender can take the asset. Now imagine that after 250,000 has been put into this asset, imagine that the rents have been increased, the occupancy rate on the multifamily has been increased. And as a result of all of this, what you end up with is an asset that's far more valuable. If the mezzanine lender then takes ownership of the asset due to a borrower default and sells it, on a loan of as small as 250,000, theoretically, that mezzanine lender could make $1 million in profit on that one deal. So let's talk about the capital stack and mezzanine lending. We gave the example here of senior debt, where there's already on this apartment community there's already $1 million in financing on place. Now say there's mezzanine debt of 250,000 and the rates on that are going to vary. It could be 18%, 14, 15%. Higher interest rate because it's technically a little bit less secure. Then you have preferred equity and sponsor equity, where those are essentially totally unsecure, but they get even higher returns potentially. Mezzanine loans are typically used in multifamily acquisition, and they're also used in the acquisition of businesses. In the capital stack, you're going to see usually the first 65% is senior debt. The middle tranche after that is something that you would find maybe preferred equity. Somewhere around there, you're also going to find mezzanine. And then the top 10, 20% is sponsor equity. Here's an example of how you can make money as a mezzanine lender. Say you make a loan at $1 million at an 18% rate. Well, you're going to collect 180,000 in interest every year. So it pays considerably more than being a lender. You also, even if you're not interested in mezzanine lending, if it's not something you would ever want to do, or it's not something you would ever want to receive, if you refer me to someone that does a mezzanine loan, I pay you $10,000. So it's definitely an easy way to make money if you know somebody that would like to earn a high rate of return. Should mezzanine be in your portfolio? Well, good question. Good question. Should it be? Well, in terms of mezzanine in your portfolio, it definitely can add significantly to the portfolio in terms of opportunities and returns. It is something that is really, really good. So that is a massive plus on that. But there's some paperwork that also goes along with it. And that paperwork is a pledge of partnership interests and an intercreditor agreement. We'll talk about those in a little bit. So an intercreditor agreement is where you have more than one creditor, more than one that's supplying debt. So you've got creditor number one, creditor number two. Who's first? Who's second? What happens if the borrower is not making enough? What happens if the borrower is not paying enough? What happens in that case with an intercreditor agreement? That is something that is resolved where the intercreditor agreement specifies exactly what's going to happen between the creditors. Now let's look at a practical problem. So we're going to talk about interest rate and payment schedule. So imagine that an investor is considering taking out a $2 million mezzanine loan, and they want the 2 million for the purposes of to acquire a company. So the loan offers an interest rate of say 10% compounded annually, and then you would calculate the interest payment. So let's imagine also that there's an equity kicker that is equal to 5% of the value of the company at the end of the loan. So now imagine that the company is valued at 50 million, but that mezzanine loan is being used essentially as some of the down payment money. So in that example here, you take the annual interest rate, which on 2 million mezzanine loan, 10%, you've got 200,000 in annual interest. You take the equity kicker, which would be, in this case, 5% on a $50 million company would be 2.5 million. And then you just calculate the return, which is the annual interest rate. We saw up here, it's 200,000. Multiply that by 5, 2.5 million. The total return is 1 million plus 2.5 million for 3.5 million. Let's look at another example, debt service coverage ratio. Imagine that a property development company, they are taking a mezzanine loan of 5 million. Imagine there's already senior debt. There's already debt that exists on the of 10 million. And the net operating income for the project is projected to be 1.8 million. Well, in that case, the senior debt might have a 6% rate. And let's imagine that the mezzanine loan has a 12% rate. So in this example, we'll look at the debt service coverage ratio and how that's actually calculated. So you're going to take the net operating income, divide it by the total debt service. So the senior debt service is 10 million. Remember, that's at 6%. So 600,000 is the senior debt service. Now we look at the mezzanine, we see it has a 12% higher rate, 5 million on that debt, 5 million debt at 12% is also 600,000. So the total debt service, when you add the senior and the mezzanines, 1.2 million. And the debt service coverage ratio would calculate out to 1.5, which would be a great debt service coverage ratio. What about exit strategy? We'll look at the problem of exit strategy. Imagine a $3 million mezzanine loan. Imagine a 3-year term for a manufacturing company. They're going to expand their operations. The deal would also include not just the interest. The lender's not going to earn just interest. They're also going to get a warrant. The warrant will let them purchase 10% of the equity at the end of the term. So if the company today is valued at 8 million, we'll calculate the equity through the warrant to get the rate of return on the mezzanine. So first part of the calculation is you take the 10% rate on 8, multiply it by 8 million. Then the exercise value of the warrant, 800,000. The purchase price of the equity, you just multiply this out, you get 500,000. The profit from the warrant is the equity value minus the purchase price of the equity. So the profit from the warrant is 300,000. And then if you put that all together, and by the way, I'll get you a copy of the slide deck where you can look at this in more detail, but it shows that you got 3 million times 10% over 3 years, interest payments of 900,000, total profit 1.2 million. So that's how that works. I want to ask everyone, if this, especially if this is your first time here, if you look in the chat window, you should see a link to a spreadsheet. If you see a link to a spreadsheet in the chat window, please put your information in there so that I can email you a copy of the presentation and the recording, and also so I can email you a copy of the actual list of investors. It's in the chat window now. You should see a little red thing. If you just click on that, you can put your information in. Okay, so I'm also available if somebody likes this or wants to learn about other things. I'm always available. If you're watching this on the internet and you're thinking, yeah, that's interesting, I would like to learn how to do some of these deals, just get in touch with me. I've got a great program. I can show you a lot of things, especially if you're a new investor. But even if you're an experienced investor and you think you already know everything, you ought to talk to me, because I might be able to show you some things you haven't seen before. So that is it for the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now, and then I'm going to open it up for any questions or comments. So